very good evening to everyone, and thank you all for joining us today for the 4th N Srinivas Memorial Lecture, and I'm Kriti Kapila, and on behalf of the King's India Institute and the Royal Anthropological Institute, it is my immense privilege to introduce our speaker this evening, Professor Christopher Pinney. Professor Pinney is the preeminent anthropologist and historian of the image. He is currently a professor of anthropology and visual culture at the Department of Anthropology, University College London, and has previously held positions at Northwestern University and the School of Oriental and African Studies. Author of several books and papers, in 2013, Professor Pinney became one among a handful of anthropologists and sociologists to be decorated with the Padma Shri by the Indian government. Anthropometry and colonial anthropology, industrial townships and labor, the figure of Gandhi, Bhagat Singh, and latterly Anna Hazare have all provided diverse scaffoldings for Christopher Pinney's exceptional scholarship on the anthropology of visual cultures in colonial and contemporary India. Arguing against a textual and representational view of the visual, Professor Pinney's extensive work on photography and chromolithography in India reveals the power of the image in the figuration of the political and the religious. The unique grammar of the visual in India provides an aperture to understand the photographic image that is not rooted in the practice of capture. Pinney says, and I quote, "Images whose power is evaluated in terms of efficacy are difficult to understand from the viewpoint of conventional aesthetics. Conventional aesthetic discourse is still inappropriately brought to bear upon popular representational practices, and since it misses the point of them, is inevitably forced to decry their various deficits. Instead, Pinney's work has consistently drawn our attention to the corporeal relationship people have with images in relation to this efficacy of personal portraiture to godly images alike. Warning us against reading depth into the surface of the photograph, Pinney reveals this distinctively non-representational relationship between the visual and the corporeal in India. One of the many things one looks forward to in any talk by Professor Pinney, or any work of Professor Pinney, whether in printed form or in oral presentations, is the breathtaking array of images that come from his extensive ethnographic and archival collections. And in today's lecture too, Professor Pinney opens up another visual archive, that of the photographs taken by N Srinivas in his own fieldwork to read power and politics at the level that what Professor Pinney calls more than local and less than global. For this is where and how, Pinney says, post-Geertzian anthropology can best deal with the Laturian, if you may, and Struthanian, if you like, challenge of moving the discipline away from the territories and meanings and more towards networks and relations. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Christopher Pinney to deliver this year's N Srinivas Memorial Lecture, Destroying the Negatives, N Srinivas, India's Villages and Photography.
Good evening. Thank you very much all for coming. I'd like to thank the King's India Institute and the RAI for the honour of this invitation. I'd like to thank Kriti for that very thoughtful, considered introduction. It's my pleasure to be here. Now I just need to get out of this into the other PowerPoint. Okay, I recently had the good fortune to stumble across a burnt document in Mumbai's Chor Bazaar. This is the market where legend has it that the violin belonging to Queen Victoria, who never visited India, was sold after it was stolen during her visit to Bombay. I appreciate there's quite a lot of information in that sentence, so I'll repeat it. This is the market where legend has it that the violin belonging to Queen Victoria, who never visited India, was sold after it was stolen during her visit to Bombay. And I must thank Rob for this ingenious image. This is by way of explaining that many of the objects you encounter in the bazaar, Chor Bazaar, come prefabulated and get confabulated and refabulated as they pass from the seller to the often gullible buyer. You may think I am gullible in lending credence to the story I'm about to tell you, suggesting that the coincidences and temporal overlays to which this document bears witness are fissured with the kind of confabulation to which half a lifetime excitedly browsing in Chor Bazaar ought to inure one. The document appears on the face of it to be a New Year's greeting card from the photographic company of Bourne and Shepherd, dating from 1973, and which reproduces an image taken by the English photographer and co-founder of the firm, Samuel Bourne, in Calcutta in the 1860s. As you can see, the edges of the card are burnt. The index, I assume, gullibly or not, of the catastrophic fire on February the 6th, 1991, which destroyed Bourne and Shepherd's Calcutta premises in Chowringhee. Thanks to Rob again for this one. William Dalrymple has recently provided what may be a fanciful account, describing how on the morning of the fire, quote, the people of Calcutta awoke to find their streets carpeted with singed Victorian prints. Maharajas with bird's nest beards were lying in the gutters. Viceroys in white ties fluttered across the Maidan and were washed down into the Bay of Bengal. Whether this image fluttered, I do not know. I suspect it was preserved because it was in the middle of a wad of similar images bundled away and forgotten, and that because of this, the flames of the fire were only able to lick at the external surfaces of this brick of images. The image seems worth dwelling on in a lecture devoted to N Srinivas because it so perfectly embodies the complexity of what Roland Barthes termed the anterior future and the complex layering of time and event. The 1860s were rephotographed in 1973 and then further indexically seared by the events of 1991, which have left such a powerful trace. This image also allows me to pay homage to Srinivas, not as Veena Das recently urged, by replicating what he did, but by finding what was at stake for oneself. Clearly, this document also speaks to the relationship between fire and memory, to what survives and what partially remains. And of course, this document is interesting chiefly because of its ruination, because it bears the highly visible signs of the third act of its rephotographing by fire. It is as a ruin that it appeals, its value lying chiefly in what has been lost and the way in which an act of destruction so explicitly leaves its traces and adds value. So let us deal with Srinivas's fire, for which this is obviously an analogical object. It was started deliberately, according to his most detailed published account in Current Anthropology in 1980, by people he describes simply as arsonists, who placed Molotov cocktails in the early hours of April 24th, 1970, in the glass-walled telephone booths which were positioned outside some of the studies in the Stanford Center for the Advanced Study of the Behavioral Sciences. The arsonists, he later reveals, were students who had a general grudge. They, quote, regarded the center as part of the establishment, allowing fat cat social scientists to enjoy a sybaritic lifestyle in sunny California, and also an immediate provocation, quote, a rally on the Stanford University campus on the evening of April 23rd to recruit students for the Vietnam War. The Stanford Daily's press coverage suggests, conversely, that the protests were not about fat cat social scientists, but rather the presence of the ROTC, the Reserve Officer Training Corps on campus, which was a route through which commissioned officers were directly inducted from the university into the US military. Srinivas noted in that same Current Anthropology article that he'd received a letter of condolence from President Nixon, who had assumed the presidency at the beginning of the previous year. The Stanford Daily report put some flesh on the bones, detailing that the president had concluded his note with the hope that, quote, the great insights of social anthropology might serve in this moment to help you understand this tragedy. Anthropologists, no doubt, will be surprised, and I hope troubled, by this ringing endorsement of their project by Richard Nixon, though we should remember that he was writing in the wake of Project Camelot, a massively funded mid-1960s attempt to harness social science to counterinsurgency, and the forerunner of the Iraq Human Terrain Programme. In 1966, following the formal closure of Project Camelot, the US defense budget still included $34 million for behavioral and social science research. I hope that a good part of this talk will embrace Nixon's challenge. That's a phrase I never thought I'd hear myself uttering. I hope that a good part of this talk will embrace Nixon's challenge through an attempt to apply anthropological insights to Srinivas's response to the fire. But there is some basic political contextualization which is still required to understand the context of the actions of students whom Nixon described as deranged or evil. It is worth recalling that this was 2 years after the shock of the Tet Offensive and the subsequent escalation of the draft. Fire and burning was already in the air. The US would drop almost 400,000 tons of napalm on Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia during the course of the war. Designed to stick to flesh, it burnt at temperatures of between 800 and 1200 Celsius. Photographs of the suffering it caused played a large part in stoking domestic US discontent about the war, although it and the burning of villages in search and destroy missions has now become the subject of celebratory computer games. The later 1972 Pulitzer-winning image by Nick Ut showing a terrified Kim Phuc running away from exploding napalm has become iconic. Photographs such as these in turn encouraged actions such as the burning of draft cards as performances designed to be photographed and circulated as news events. The fire that so impacted Srinivas was thus born of other fires. The consequences are well known. The 3 copies of process notes representing many years of analysis were all, for contingent reasons, present in the office, and all were incinerated. The Associated Press reported that Srinivas was in a state of shock and unable to speak. The director of the centre I see here says in the right-hand column, what was burned was a life, an entire life totally destroyed. Children wrote him letters of sympathy enclosing dollar bills. Srinivas's dismissal of arsonists and his reluctance to frame the Stanford protests in any significant engaged way in the context of Vietnam and the huge bombing program and incursion into Cambodia, which was becoming public at exactly the time of the fire, are consonant with the picture that André Bette paints of his former supervisor as, quote, by no means a radical, although one apparently who had more time, and this is in certain respects hugely surprising, for what Ambedkar said about the village than for the views of M.K. Gandhi. Ambedkar, of course, believed villagers were, quote, infected by ancient prejudices and were, quote, dens of ignorance, a position which, as we shall see, is hard to reconcile with Srinivas's evident love of Rampura. Back in Stanford, Srinivas was given a new office at the back of the building and persuaded by another centre fellow, Sol Tax, that he must press ahead with his volume, investing his own personality in his narrative. But as Srinivas recalls, the ruins of the event created problems. Quote, several cardboard boxes, each filled with scraps of partially burnt notes, had been stored in the study, and an acrid smell of burnt paper pervaded the room. Try as I might, I could not ignore the smell. It stood in the way of my efforts to recall my days in Rampura. The acrid smell of the fire, a memory of the recent catastrophe, obstructed more distant memories. David Shulman has argued that in the South Indian tradition, smells serve as, quote, characteristic markers of identity, capable of transformation, but generally linked to a sense of profound layers of experience and being, end quote. But the fire had clearly, in the short term, deformed Srinivas's relationship to experience. But this would eventually change. Srinivas would ultimately express, if not his appreciation of the arsonist's actions, at least his recognition of the role they played in his writing a book. Supposedly, this has been contested, not least by Adrian Mayer, who I'm delighted to see here, entirely based on memory in a prefatory note in The Remembered Village. So that was a rather complicated sentence. What I was trying to say was that in that prefatory note, Srinivas acknowledges the productivity of having lost his notes in this fire. So far, I've focused on the act of destruction that was to give birth to Srinivas's best-known book, and it's probably true that these events are so well known that you've as yet learned nothing much new. Let me now focus on a different act of destruction, the one signalled in my title, Destroying the Negatives. To get there, we should briefly reprise the role that photography played in Srinivas's publications, and especially The Remembered Village, which is saturated with references to photography. Srinivas was an eager, albeit self-deprecating photographer, and in The Remembered Village he provides numerous details of what interested him as a photographer. He appears to mention only one photograph in the village that is not evidently taken by him, this being a group image of villagers commemorating the assassination, or marking rather the assassination of Gandhi. He notes that the feast that concluded the 13 days of mourning was traditional. Quote, only the photograph was a new addition. It may well be that this image survives in files stored by his daughters, Tulsi and Lakshmi, in Boston, but these, together with his other materials, are currently inaccessible, though I hope to be able to work on them in May of this year, and I should thank Tulsi and Lakshmi for supplying the image which we saw in the opening slide of Srinivas. Srinivas's camera, he writes, contributed to his popularity. Although he was, he claims, a, quote, poor photographer, he makes up for this by his, quote, willingness to snap everything he saw. Photography is presented as a pleasurable activity and an engine of social warmth. He proudly shows his photos and reports that, quote, generally the villagers loved being photographed, and the examination of the prints provoked much laughter and comment. The myth that the photographs would be shown abroad added to the pleasure, and his camera became, as he put it, a passport to every place. In a particularly rich passage, Srinivas argues that his arrival with his camera to photograph people at work broke the monotony of their labour. Furthermore, his camera opened up gender barriers, and he was invited to photograph wives, daughters, and daughters-in-law. Little of this is evident in The Remembered Village, whose plates are largely landscape studies. All this enthusiastic endeavour earned him the nickname Chamaraman, which, as he notes, in Kannada, as also in Hindi, through the term chama, refers to the long tail of yak's tails which were used by servants to keep flies away from rajas and by priests during the puja of icons. This metaphorical association between the camera and technologies which help present divine and political power in their most potent and perfected form points to a similar set of associations in the village, which will occupy the second half of this talk. If you were to draw a line directly between Delhi and Mumbai and cut it in half at a distance which I happen to know through studying the fare tables in railway timetables is 694 kilometres, you would find yourself in an industrial town called Nagda Junction. And if you were to then travel 6 kilometres south, you would come to a village called Bhatisura, where I've been working intermittently since 1982. In that village, you will hear echoes of the metaphor that informs Chamraman. For instance, Jagdish Sharma, who we see here, the pujari of the Krishna temple, once joked that my video camera embodied yantra, mantra, and tantra. Yantra being the design made in Japan, mantra being the information it stored, and tantra being the magic of technology, its machinery. Chamar whisks feature imprinted images of deities. Here we see Ram Devji's devotees, the devotee on the right, and serve not only as devices for conferring value and signalling one's devotion, but are often, when deployed in pairs, a means of establishing frontality and symmetry, which are key elements in local photographic aesthetics. Jains dance with whisks in temple festivals, on this occasion during the Pran Pratishta of a new murti. Temples often display them by the deity's throne, here in a Devnarayan shrine, you can just see on the left. And village shamans, gorlas, use them to confer protective and curative blessings. The cameraman and chamraman directs our attention to the expectation in rural India that photography, contra Walter Benjamin's argument, is usually seen as a mechanism for the preservation and consolidation of aura rather than its destruction. Frequently, photographs that I like, villagers find puzzling because they lack frontality and symmetry, are not full body, and may catch people in informal poses or expressions which diverge from the idealized self-image they hope to present to the camera. It is in this context that it becomes useful to make explicit that mantra, in its earlier usage by Jagdish Sharma, is conceptualized as something very different from the contingency that Walter Benjamin theorized, the uncontrollable flow of information that made possible the optical unconscious, or the kind of data misrecognition that the historian Carlo Ginzburg argued made his Friulian Benandanti archive so, I'm tempted to say, photographically rich. Mantra brings with it a sense of something highly skilled, something learned and perfected, and perfectly executed. In the village, you will often hear mantras, of course, articulated in such a careful manner that your attention is drawn to the materiality of sound and to the understanding that efficacy resides in perfect pronunciation. It is expected that cameras should be used in a similar way. This might be one route to understanding the expectation that villagers have that a photographed image of a mourned relative is likely to produce a better image than the original. Against this background, Srinivas' self-deprecation of his photographic skills and all his talk of photographs as mere snaps shines through as charmingly disingenuous, for his efforts and skills were evidently highly regarded by villagers. If we take the chamraman's metaphor seriously, then they conceived of themselves as kings or gods, and Srinivas as a servant or pujari attending to their needs. But perhaps Srinivas' most arresting observation concerning photographic practice is an incident in which he's, quote, invited by two brothers who were enemies of the headman to photograph part of a tank embankment which had been breached by floodwater and had ruined their banana crop. He obliges them, and they obtain a promise from Srinivas that he would, quote, send them copies of the pictures which he had taken. Subsequently, he learnt from the headman that the two brothers had initiated a lawsuit against him for the destruction of his crop, and that his photographs were likely to be used in evidence. Srinivas expresses his response in the following words, quote, "I felt humiliated and assured the headman that I had no knowledge of this matter when I took the photographs, and that I would destroy the negatives." Srinivas concludes the paragraph by reproaching himself for his, quote, "foolish behaviour." Perhaps we should be outraged by this, not only because of his complicity with the headman, but for its breach of what Ariella Azoulay, in her profoundly important work, terms photography's civil contract. She would argue that we cannot own photographs. They are merely temporarily in our possession, and since they speak to higher political and egalitarian truths, we are not at liberty to destroy them. A similar civil contract was imposed on me when I first took a video camera to the village in 2004 and found myself essentially forced to film Dalit gorlas or shamans to provide evidence of the intensity of their practices. These goddess mediums saw my camera as an ally in a political battle for legitimacy. Higher castes disparaged their practices as goddess mimicry, an untruth which the camera would, it was hoped, disprove. Srinivas's readiness to participate in the destruction of evidence, in this case of photographic data, and to openly acknowledge it in the wake of the grievous destruction at Stamford, is paradoxical to say the least. He also talks about this in a very interesting way in a filmed interview available on Alan McFarlane's website. But this is part of a larger pharmacon-like duality frequently visible in his writing, in which phenomena and actions oscillate between poison and cure. Take, for instance, his startling response in a 1998 interview with Chris Fuller to Evans Pritchard's suggestion that he revise once more the text which would appear as Religion and Society among the Coorgs. Already rewritten through numerous drafts and accepted by the Clarendon press, Srinivas declared that he'd had enough and that, quote, either it went to the press as it was or he could throw it into the fire before which he was sitting. Now, this might be taken simply as evidence of the biting cold of post-war Oxford winters. My point is that in 1998, he appears to avoid its obvious metaphorical resonance with the 1970 Stanford events. This provides perhaps one frame through which we might understand the metaphors of and allusions to fire, which in addition to photography come thick and fast in The Remembered Village. We are told that Kale Gowda's diminishing passion for gambling and liquor was like, quote, a fire going out. Then there is the memorable case of the young Dalit by the name of Pija, who had taken twigs from one of Nadu Gowda's trees to feed his sheep. Nadu became increasingly angry in an ensuing dispute with the headman about the extent of the fine for this technical theft. Nadu Gowda then claimed that if he merely opened his eyes, Pija would be reduced to ashes, in a reference to Shiv, who had incinerated Kama after he was disturbed while deep in meditation, illustrated here in a late 19th century Calcutta lithograph. The same Nadu Gowda subsequently admitted to feeling, quote, fire in his stomach when contemplating the excellence of the headman's cultivated fields. Fire also appears benignly in Srinivas's account of the manner in which he first arrived in Rampura. And neighbours used to exchange live embers as the chief means of obtaining fire for cooking. This, as Srinivas notes, had great symbolic significance, since it established a relationship of reciprocity. Offenders who were ostracised from the village were denied this access to neighbourly fire. Charles Sanders Peirce had, of course, invoked the relationship of smoke to fire as an example of the index, And the contagion of fire to fire via embers serves as an equally good example of the physical contiguity which Peirce pointed out was also the condition of photography. Fire's appearance as part of Rampura's social process in Srinivas's text is perhaps one of the ways in which he reaches back beyond the charred remains of his notes and whose acrid smell stood in the way of recollection. The poison becomes the cure within the fluid space of the pharmacon. In Bhattisura, photography is not used as a vehicle of memory, of yad or yadgar, as a unidirectional archival gesture. It is more commonly seen and mobilized as a generative conduit to live power. Roland Barthes famously wrote of looking at a photograph of Napoleon's younger brother taken in 1852 and marveling that he was, quote, looking at eyes that looked at the emperor. A very important image in this village, which you can see here on the left, is of a guy called Bera Bharti, who was murdered during the emergency, a key Situ leader, a member of the village, one of the village Jain families. When I read Roland Barthes on the eyes that looked at the emperor, I think of Bera Bharti's eyes. Peirce, Charles Sanders Peirce, prefigured this in a 1902 text in which he argued that, quote, an index is a thing which, and I'm quoting, having been forcibly affected by its object, forcibly affects its interpretant and causes that interpretant to be forcibly affected by the object, and so on. This endless chain of contagious indexicality comes close to describing the Bhattisura theory of photography. Photographs of the deceased are desired so that they might be used as the basis for ancestor images which are worshipped throughout the year on specific dates and for a fortnight during Pitra Paksh or Ancestors' Fortnight. The images that emerge, and earlier this was done through overpainting by itinerant artists, now it is done by Photoshop, are future-oriented idealizations from which contingency is stripped away. The image on the left is actually extracted from an Aadhaar identification card and incorporated, as you can see, into this double memorial portrait. They then join other ancestors grouped together in special areas of puja rooms where they frequently manifest themselves in the bodies of their descendants, especially if they have met sudden and untimely deaths. So here the role of Bera Bharti, murdered in the emergency, is exemplary. Among Jains in the village, the unsettled prets or souls which manifest with oracular powers are known as patababjis. In Bhattisura, the most powerful presence has been Munna, who died as a child from tetanus and who has incarnated in his older brother Prakash on a very frequent basis for several decades. The patababji in Prakash is activated by photography and fire. He seems to draw down the power from a beautiful montaged image of Munna depicted inside rose petals and supercharge his body by breathing in huge quantities of smoke from a havan or sacred fire. This chain of indexicality produces a frenzied energy. Thrashing is the local term. He pounds the mud floor with his hands, loudly grunting and breathing in more and more smoke before subsiding into quietude and then offering predictions and advice to family members. This triangulation of photography, fire, and loss has been endlessly repeated through the years, with periodic additions to the population of patababjis occasioned by tragic, untimely deaths that have created roaming prets whose power needs to be channeled. The most recent case in the same Gotra is that of Chimanlal, who you can see on the right of this image. A popular lawyer renowned for his work with the poor, he died suddenly in 2013 of a heart attack. His memorial portrait now hangs alongside Munna and other forebears in the puja room, of my oldest friend Pukraj, whose son Atit now regularly thrashes with the presence of Chimanlal. The photograph, together with fire and smoke, serve as physical conduits to the Pattababji. It is as if Atit can smell the smoke in the charred remains of the Born and Shepherd image with which I opened this talk. I see, because of the lights, some of these images may be barely readable. This relationship between vision and fire is sometimes made highly explicit. Consider, for instance, Nazar Utarna, or the removal of the evil eye. The person afflicted with Nazar, the patient, sits before the healer. In this case, the healer was the patient's father, but elsewhere is likely to be a Brahmin priest or Dalit shaman who will perform the procedure. The healer prepares a roughly 1 foot long wick made from raw cotton, which is then soaked in ghee. This is then placed against a knife and presented to the head of the patient 7 times before being fixed to the knife and allowed to hang vertically over a small water pot, which is placed directly in front of the patient. The wick is then ignited, and as it burns, with the accompaniment of much hissing and spluttering, drops of burning ghee regularly drop into the water pot below, where a film of soot starts to gather. This material process visualizes the transference of the physical presence of Nazar into the water pot, the relocation of Nazar from the body of the afflicted onto the surface of the water. It recalls the common anti-Nazar phrase to be seen throughout North India, which declares, "Evil Nazar person, your face will go black," except that in Nazar Utarna, it is a kind of watery eye that turns black. Georges Bataille would have loved it. The transformative power of fire is endlessly manifest elsewhere in the village, from the kappa, the bowls of fire which precipitate the appearance of goddesses. So numerous goddesses in this village whose thrashing is inaugurated by their holding an acceptance of the kappa, which then is eventually cooled. And this transformative power of fire ranges across this towards satis made immortal by their incineration, the endless professional activities of male mediums for goddesses, to the diyas, the lights and fireworks which illuminate the darkness of Diwali so that Lakshmi can see her way, to the blazing fires of Holi that play such an important role in sustaining the myth of the unity of the village. The Holi Agh is the central dramaturgical energy in a festival whose ideological claim is one of the equality of all members of the village. Everyone is one, the claim goes, high and low, clean caste and Dalit, male and female, old and young. These are all, it is continually reiterated, unified as simple, singular villagers. It is almost 5 a.m., and there is the merest glimmer of the rising sun starting to pulse in the east, just beginning to ripple the solid blue blackness of night. And then a young Rajput arrives, the village Mukhya, the hereditary chief who circles the fire, setting it alight. The tinder at the bottom ignites and then starts to engulf the entire structure, which once fully afire starts to radiate the most profound heat, burning away the winter and ushering in the spring. Recumbent figures, young and old, release themselves from their habitual crumpled stances, stretching themselves as the mounting heat starts to pervade their being. The flames jet into a region high above the village, and the heat starts to manifest itself as a massive irradiating force. It is difficult to overstate the nature of the image that the fire presents of a community seemingly thermally at one with itself. It is, as Guy Debord might have said if he were an anthropologist, community distilled as pure spectacle. Except, of course, that it's not. For my photographs and notebooks reveal that there were 3 other holy fires, ones organised by Ravidasis, Bagaris and Banjaras, these being the two largest Dalit and Adivasi communities in the village. When clean castes are asked about this, a range of responses is offered. We used to have a single fire, but then the Dalits and Adivasis decided that it was too far to walk. When Dalits and Adivasis are asked, the response usually stresses exclusion. They won't let us use their wells or enter their temples, so why would they let us circle their fire? The byproduct of fire is also crucially important. Certain images, notably Sai Babas, commonly exuding vibhuti, ashes, and vibhuti also playing a central role in the diagnoses that Dalit shamans offer, both as a visual field, which along with grains of rice are minutely examined as part of the consultation, and as a medicine to be eaten directly, or kept with the patient's body, folded in paper or sewn in a red cloth pouch. Most villagers will carry such a packet of ash and have many pouches distributed in various parts of their house. Let us return to events in Stamford and the legacy of that fire. It is those events which gave birth to the myth which is the remembered village, the bird reborn from the ashes as the Latin inscription on a scroll subsequently given to Srinivas on his departure by Stanford Centre Fellows, declared ex igni renascimur, enclosed an image of a phoenix. If their knowledge of Hindu renunciatory practices had been greater, perhaps they might have been tempted to depict Gandhi, or an Agori internalizing the heat of desire, quenching fire in order to reconstruct themselves, as Dumont argued, as an individual standing outside the world in a paradigmatic example of distantiation. In his introduction to his edited 1955 volume, India's Villages, the earlier edition on the left, the subsequent reissue on the right, Srinivas had made a very strong defense of distantiation and defamiliarization as ethnographic method. He said it was, quote, much more difficult for an Indian to study India than for a non-Indian, since, quote, one is so fundamentally and even hopelessly enslaved in one's own society that detachment is well nigh impossible. Fire perhaps granted a manumission, a freedom from that enslavement through the physical destruction of the overly familiar life of the village embedded in his original data. But perhaps the literary and narrative qualities that were released and authorized by the destruction by fire of the notes which would have underpinned a far more austere ethnography, The Social Structure of a Multi-Caste Village in South India was his working title, is best understood in terms of what Gaston Bachelard, in his classic The Psychoanalysis of Fire, termed the Novalis complex. Novalis, the late 18th century German romantic, is often described as a magical idealist and engages Bachelard because of the manner in which fire functions not as a destructive force, as a dramatic play of light and shade, but as a generator of heat and, quote, the need for shared warmth. Bachelard discusses agricultural fires which purify the fields as fires of fusion. But Novalis demands our attention because he eschewed the, quote, purely visual knowledge of fire as light, eulogizing instead, quote, a satisfaction of the thermal sense and the deep-seated consciousness of calorific happiness. My title, Destroying the Negatives, was provoked in the first place by Srinivas's account of his obeisance to the headman when confronted with a legal case in which his own photographs would be used as evidence. He introduces this instance as an example of his failure to steer clear of factions. This leads towards a further and final sense in which we might interpret Srinivas's legacy as involving the destruction of the negatives, that is, as an embracing of positivity, albeit one which has been widely politically critiqued. Bachelard argues that we need to grasp the affective primitivity of fire, a primitive phenomenology which fabricates objects out of phantoms that are projected by reverie, creating images out of desires, material experiences out of somatic experiments, and fire out of love. For Bachelard, Novalis' poetry was an attempt to relive primitivity, to reawaken the need for shared warmth. In a passage which seems to echo in an extraordinary way the manner in which Srinivas took the light and drama of the arson at Stamford and turned it into the gift of warmth, Bachelard characterises the Novalis complex as involving the consciousness of an inner heat which always takes precedence over a purely visual knowledge of light. For Novalis, fire is translated into, quote, thermal satisfaction, a communion at the interior where there is a thermal sympathy in which heat is diffused and equalized, such that it becomes, quote, indistinct like the contour of a dream. To all those who criticize Srinivas for his supposed biases, I would stress this: he provides the contours of a dream, one which villagers made for him. Novalis' stress on the calorific happiness provided by heat, rather than destructive light and shadows of fire, is very firmly echoed in Srinivas' essay on village studies and their significance. There is a stirring defence of intensive participant observation anthropology against economics and other disciplines. In a prolonged discussion of why economists are wrong to criticise Indian peasants for their approach to cattle, he recounts how once he, quote, saw a peasant thrusting paddy sheaves into the mouth of a bullock, and I asked him why, when there was an acute rice shortage in the cities, he was giving it stuff which could keep human beings alive, and he replied, "Didn't it help me in sowing and transplanting? Wouldn't it eat a little of what it helps me to grow?" This put me in mind of the recent birth of twin calves to Ganga in Bhatisura. Cows almost never birth more than one calf, but Ganga produced two. Word spread quickly, and numerous villagers came with their mobiles to photograph this Ashcharya event. Ganga's calves and their photographic records are emblematic of a wondrous realism increasingly stored in village cell phones. Srinivas's earlier book, Religion and Society Among the Coorgs of South India, made quite clear Srinivas's commitment to what he called a field view approach to anthropology as opposed to a book view approach, and clearly demonstrated an investment in the village community as a self-sufficient unit of analysis. This view was made even more explicit in India's villages. Consider in this context a striking map painted on the side of the village primary school in Bhatisura, mirroring the Panch Kroshi, or 5 circles, that are a feature of pilgrimage sites such as Ujjain and Benares. The map positions Bhatisura at the centre of an ordered cosmos. It is surrounded by Nagda with its Shiv temple and Birla temple, and then Ujjain, to which it is linked by railway, then Madhya Pradesh, and finally India, marked by the Qutb Minar in Delhi, the Ganges, and the Taj Mahal. This worldview echoes other aspects of life in the village. The ripples evoke the 7 generations of ancestors who should continue to be worshipped. The map also serves as a concentrically ordered talisman against the massive anxiety about chinta, or uncertainty, that besieges peasants precariously living in a state of continual emergency. Although fire may energize a huge number of dramatic thrashings or possession events in the village, these are all highly social events and are unexpectedly, perhaps, often integrative. And this image of order reminds us that Bhatisurans don't generally relish photography for its contingency, its blushes, as Carlo Ginzburg might say. The light and shade of fire and of photography in its evidential charge is softened for incorporation into what are often consensual projects. Consensual projects. And we see in the map how the village attempts to collapse time into space. The village becomes a chronotope that excludes or minimizes the unexpected. And I should stress that Ganga's calves are really very much seen as part of a collective village possession. This is a blessing perceived to have descended on the whole of the village. And in case you're thinking that this is part of a higher caste narrative, I ought to say that the owner of Ganga was Ravidas, or, well, a Dalit caste member. The Bhattisura school map returns us to a central debate about method that opened up a gulf between Srinivas and Dumont in the 1950s. This was not only to do with book view versus field view. Recall that the opening sentence of the very first 1957 issue of Dumont and Pocock's Contributions to Indian Sociology made the claim that, quote, the first condition for a sound development of a sociology of India is found in the establishment of a proper relation between it and classical Indology. Because, as they said, India is one, a problem then arose of the relationship between constituent elements and the overall structure. In a review essay, also in the first volume of Contributions, focusing on Makim Marriott's Village India and Srinivas's India's Villages, which appeared in the same year, Dumont and Pocock pressed the point further, noting that many of the contributors to those volumes were evidently imprisoned by a false category imposed by the editors, and wanted to, quote, overthrow the village as a social fact of the first order, i.e. to rebel against the Srinivas agenda. Dumont and Pocock protested the phantom idea of the village, which was in danger of producing its own simulacrum. I quote, a field worker takes a village as a convenient centre for his investigation and all too easily comes to confer upon that village a kind of sociological reality which it in fact does not possess. It is buildings and people, they suggest, which generate this problem. I quote again, the architectural and demographic fact which the village is lures us away from a structural perspective where things exist only in the relations which are the proper objects of study, to an atomistic or elemental point of view where things exist in themselves. From this perspective, Srinivas had been lured, bewitched into thinking that an entity which can only have meaning in its relationship to others was a thing in itself. Dumont and Pocock's approach is exemplified much better by another map in the village, displayed in a small shop selling SIM cards and which shows the local Vodafone, or Voda as it's known locally, network. The Voda poster advertises the more than 18,000 cities and villages which have coverage set incongruously above a sombre northern scene of a tent near a gloomy lake. And Adrian Mayer might be interested to see Dewas appearing bottom right. Bhattisura, which I've usually visited several times a year since 1982, has seen enormous changes. Kutcha mud houses, this is from 1982, have been replaced, this is the same street, by concrete structures. This is the same street last year. A highly varied arable pattern with huge subsistence diversity has been almost obliterated by two cash crops, soya and wheat. The boom in tractor ownership in the last decade, and in the last 3 years, the arrival of combine harvesters from the Punjab has dramatically changed labour opportunities for the rural poor and has had dramatic environmental impacts as anything that obstructs the free passage of machinery has been removed from the landscape. Dalits now call themselves Dalits, and Ambedkar is now a significant part of the local political landscape, and that was not the case 30 years ago. But this has done little to diminish the idea that the village is potentially a place of peace and tranquility, whose shanti is opposed to the tumult of the city. It remains the place where very deep histories remain visibly embedded in a locality through the presence of Beru clan shrines, Sagats and Jujars, a whole set of categories of spirits and potent forces which have visible traces throughout the village. In this context, the Bhattisura map's concentric logic makes perfect sense. If the Vodafone map might be taken to illustrate Dumont's view of the structural network within which locality can only ever have a spurious reality, since even if you have a local tower, it needs to be connected to a much wider grid, the school map might be taken as an emblem of Srinivas's view of India's villages, of which Rampura was offered as one example. In the final moving and elegiac chapter of The Remembered Village, Srinivas describes his farewell from the olfactory warmth of Rampura in preparation for teaching in Oxford in January. As he notes, quote, "The prospect of leaving the warmth and sun of Mysore for the cold and wet of an Oxford winter was not exactly exciting." He describes his own self-pity at this imminent relocation and his envy of villagers who, quote, "spent all their lives in one place, whose relationships were stable and whose routines never varied." Despite the fact that much of The Remembered Village shows how untrue this characterization is, the reader is persuaded that Rampura is, as he writes, quote, "a snug and cosy place," just as most Bhattasurans think of their village with affection, as a place of tranquility, despite its high levels of unemployment, dramatic class inequalities, and exclusionary caste practices. The Bhattisura map, with the village school and post office at the centre, and swathes of blue rivers, including the Chambal and Narmada, seem to visually echo the most lyrical description in the whole of Srinivas's account, which he saves for his last paragraph. He is sitting on the bus en route for Mysore, from where he will proceed to Bombay and then Oxford. It is a scene of departure. The chapter is titled Farewell, recollected in Stanford following the fateful fire of 1970. His farewell to the village and parallel farewell to the dry information of his ethnographic field data release a poetic desire to immerse himself in what is disappearing. Quote, "I wanted to drink in every detail of the vanishing countryside," he writes. Quote, "The land dipped and rose and went round sudden rises while the bus rattled along, and through it all I had a brief and tantalizing glimpses of the shimmering Kaveri flowing in the distance." This concluding passage of Srinivas's memory ethnography demonstrates what words can do and which the camera usually cannot. It is perhaps the most beautiful testimony to what he described in the book's epigram as, quote, "the part played by the arsonists in the birth of this book and the sometimes creative consequences of destruction." Thank you very much.